The Bronx in summer was an orchestra of survival. Fire hydrants spraying arcs of temporary relief. Mothers calling children home in languages that predated borders. The constant percussion of elevated trains shaking apartment walls like metronomes counting down to something nobody wanted to name. Bobby Darin learned rhythm before he learned to read, heard melodies in arguments conducted through thin walls, found harmony in the chaos of a neighborhood that never slept because sleep required the luxury of feeling safe. He was born with a heart that wouldn't cooperate, a traitorous organ that skipped beats and fluttered like a trapped bird trying to escape his chest. The doctors gave his mother a timeline with all the warmth of a train schedule. 12 years, maybe 15 if they were careful, if they were lucky, if they prayed to the right gods in the right ways. She absorbed this information with the stoicism of women who'd already buried too much, then went home and told Bobby nothing except that he was special, that he had gifts, that the world was waiting for him. Bobby was 8 when he figured out he was dying, not from any conversation or medical revelation, but from the way adults looked at him, that particular combination of tenderness and grief that people reserve for things too precious to keep. He watched his grandmother's face when she thought he wasn't looking, saw something ancient and unbearable moving beneath her expression like continental plates shifting, and Bobby, who was smarter than any 8-year-old had a right to be, did the math. He had a decade, maybe a little more, to become someone who mattered. Most children given a death sentence would shrink, would become careful, would wrap themselves in cotton and avoid anything that might accelerate the inevitable. Bobby did the opposite. He became a man possessed, driven by an engine that ran on borrowed time and pure desperation. If he only had 12 years, then every minute had to count double, triple, 10 times over. He threw himself into music the way a drowning man grabs a lifeline. Except Bobby knew the lifeline was temporary and the drowning was guaranteed. His voice arrived before puberty should have allowed it, rich, textured, carrying emotional weight that seemed imported from someone else's lifetime. He sang in school productions, in church basements, at family gatherings, anywhere someone would listen. And people always listened because Bobby sang like every performance might be his last, which it very well could be. He learned piano with obsessive focus, drums with manic energy, studied arrangements like they were sacred texts that might contain the secret to immortality. The neighborhood knew him as that Casotto kid, the one with the weak heart and the strong voice, the boy who seemed to vibrate at a different frequency than everyone else. Teachers didn't know what to do with him. His intelligence was obvious but undisciplined, his energy inexhaustible but chaotic. Bobby consumed information ravenously, learning everything he could about music, performance, business, anything that might help him build the empire he needed to construct before time ran out. At 14, he was already performing in Manhattan clubs that shouldn't have admitted someone his age, using borrowed IDs and borrowed confidence, singing standards with an authority that made bartenders forget to check his age too carefully. He studied the greats, Sinatra's phrasing, Cole's smoothness, Bennett's technical perfection, absorbing their techniques and filtering them through his own desperate urgency. Bobby wasn't trying to be the next anyone. He was trying to be the first and only Bobby Darin before the clock ran out. High school was an inconvenience he tolerated because dropping out would worry his grandmother, and worrying her felt like stealing from the limited time they had together. But his real education happened after dark, in smoke-filled rooms where he learned the currency of charisma, the economy of entertainment, the brutal mathematics of making it in a business designed to chew up dreamers and spit out cautionary tales. He was 17 when he made the decision that would define everything that followed. Bobby Casotto wasn't a name that fit on a marquee, wasn't a name that suggested the kind of stardom he needed to achieve. He needed something that sounded like it was born for spotlights, something that could carry the weight of the legend he intended to become. Bobby Darin arrived fully formed one afternoon, a creation as deliberate as any stage persona, and Bobby Casado began his slow fade into history. New York's music scene in the mid-50s was an ecosystem of ambition and desperation, with predators at every level waiting to exploit hunger. Bobby navigated it with the instincts of someone who understood he didn't have time for the usual apprenticeship, the slow climb, the patient building of a career. He needed to explode immediately and completely, or there wouldn't be a career at all. He wrote songs in stolen hours, melodies that arrived fully formed like transmissions from somewhere beyond his conscious mind. The act of creation felt like the only thing that made sense, the only currency he possessed that might buy him more time. Not literal time, Bobby wasn't delusional, but the kind of immortality that came from leaving something behind that couldn't be erased by a faulty heart valve. The recording contract came after 100 rejections that would have destroyed someone with the luxury of trying again later. But Bobby didn't have later, so he kept pushing until a producer heard something in his voice that transcended technique, that quality of urgent authenticity that made listeners lean forward involuntarily. The first singles went nowhere, disappeared into the vast ocean of forgotten attempts. But Bobby studied each failure like a forensic investigator, learning what worked and what died on impact. Then came the song that changed everything. A novelty number, almost silly, the kind of thing serious artists dismissed as beneath them. But Bobby heard something in it, an infectious energy, a hooks that grabbed and didn't let go, a chance to showcase the charisma he'd been weaponizing since childhood. He recorded it with every ounce of charm and swagger he possessed, singing like his life depended on it because, in the only way that mattered to him, it did. The success was immediate and disorienting. Radio stations couldn't stop playing it. Teenagers bought it in numbers that made executives recalculate their assumptions. Bobby Darin went from unknown to unavoidable in the span of weeks, his face suddenly everywhere, his voice inescapable. He was 22 years old, and according to his own calculations, he'd already used up more than half his allotted time. But instead of celebrating, Bobby felt the pressure intensify. This success wasn't the destination, it was barely the beginning. Novelty hits were ephemeral by definition. He needed to prove he was more than a gimmick, more than a lucky break. He needed to establish himself as a serious artist, a genuine talent, someone who would be remembered after the current fad faded and the next sensation arrived to erase him. He transformed himself with calculated precision. If they wanted to see him as a teen idol, he'd show them a sophisticated crooner. He studied the great standards, learned to inhabit songs written by genuine masters, developed an approach that honored tradition while injecting his own desperate vitality. The orchestra recordings came next, lush arrangements that positioned Bobby as heir to Sinatra's throne, as the next great interpreter of the American songbook. The critics who dismissed him as a novelty act suddenly had to reconsider. This kid had depth, had range, had an understanding of phrasing that suggested either premature maturity or access to some ancient musical wisdom. Bobby's voice had that quality, young but knowing, smooth but with an undercurrent of something darker, as if he sang from a place most people didn't visit until they'd accumulated decades of experience. Sandra Dee entered his life like a spotlight cutting through fog, all blonde innocence and studio-manufactured sweetness, the exact opposite of everything Bobby had come from. Their romance was inevitable from a Hollywood perspective, the rising crooner and America's sweetheart, a pairing so perfect it seemed scripted by the same executives who greenlit their movies. But what developed between them transcended the manufactured narrative. Bobby loved her with an intensity that frightened him, loved her the way someone loves when they know their capacity to love has an expiration date stamped on it from birth. He proposed after weeks, married her while critics were still trying to decide if he was legitimate or lucky. and dove into the role of husband with the same manic energy he brought to everything. If he had limited time, then he needed to experience everything: fame, love, family, legacy, compressed into whatever space remained. They were beautiful together, photographed constantly, held up as proof that fairy tales existed in a cynical industry. But Bobby carried secrets that no amount of success could erase. His heart was deteriorating on schedule, each beat borrowed against a debt that would eventually be called in full. He worked relentlessly, accepting every opportunity, pushing his body past reasonable limits, driven by the certainty that stopping meant acknowledging the truth he'd been running from since childhood. The movies came next, because Bobby needed to conquer every medium, needed to prove his versatility before time ran out. He approached acting with typical intensity, studying technique, working with coaches, demanding perfection from himself and everyone around him. The films varied in quality but established him as more than a singer, as someone capable of inhabiting different personas, different emotional landscapes. But the pressure was accumulating like interest on an unpayable loan. Bobby Darin, the public figure, was everywhere. Records, films, television appearances, nightclub performances that packed venues with audiences desperate to see the phenomenon. Bobby Casado, the dying kid from the Bronx, was still there underneath it all, counting heartbeats, calculating how much longer the machine could run before it seized completely. His marriage to Sandra became complicated by success and separation. He was always working, always chasing the next project, always running from the deadline only he could see. She wanted normalcy, wanted a husband who came home, wanted to build the kind of life that required believing in tomorrow. Bobby couldn't give her that, couldn't slow down, couldn't stop long enough to explain that every moment not spent creating was a moment wasted. They had a son, and Bobby felt terror unlike anything he'd experienced on stage. This tiny human, this perfect creature, depended on a father who might not make it to the kid's 10th birthday. Bobby looked at his baby boy and saw himself, saw the Bronx, saw the countdown clock, and felt a responsibility so crushing it made his damaged heart stutter even harder. What kind of legacy was he building? What would he leave behind besides records and film reels? The 60s arrived and demanded different things from its artists. The smooth sophistication that had served Bobby so well suddenly felt outdated, replaced by raw energy and social consciousness. Bobby watched younger acts surge past him, their music speaking to a generation that didn't care about big band arrangements or perfectly executed standards. He could have held on to his established audience, could have become a nostalgia act performing his hits for people who remembered when he mattered. Instead, Bobby reinvented himself again. He grew his hair, picked up a guitar, wrote protest songs that channeled his private rage into public activism. The transformation confused his original fans and didn't entirely convince the younger audience he was courting. But Bobby didn't care about playing it safe. Safe required believing in a future worth protecting, and Bobby had stopped believing in futures when he learned to count backwards from 12. His marriage dissolved with the inevitability of buildings that had developed structural cracks too deep to repair. Sandra left taking their son, and Bobby told himself it was better this way, that they deserved someone capable of providing stability. But late at night, alone in hotel rooms in cities he couldn't differentiate anymore, Bobby felt the loss like another organ failing, another part of himself shutting down ahead of schedule. He threw himself into political activism with characteristic extremism, as if changing the world might earn him a stay of execution from whatever cosmic force had cursed him with a broken heart. Bobby performed at rallies, raised money for causes, aligned himself with movements that terrified his handlers and confused his fans. He needed to matter in ways that transcended entertainment, needed to believe his abbreviated existence might contribute to something larger than hit records and box office receipts. But the activism isolated him further. The establishment that had embraced him as a charming crooner now saw him as a threat, a troublemaker, someone who'd forgotten his place. Radio stations stopped playing his new material. Concert bookings dried up. Bobby Darin, who'd been unavoidable just years earlier, suddenly found himself avoidable, disposable, another casualty of an industry that replaced yesterday's heroes with tomorrow's sensations at industrial speed. His body was failing faster now, the symptoms he'd been ignoring, exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure, pain that radiated from his chest like ripples from a stone thrown into dark water, became impossible to dismiss. Doctors spoke in urgent tones about interventions, about surgeries that might buy him time but couldn't promise cures. Bobby listened with the detachment of someone who'd been preparing for this conversation his entire life. The decision to undergo open-heart surgery came not from fear of dying but from the realization that he hadn't finished yet. Bobby had built an empire of sound and image, had conquered multiple mediums, had loved and lost and reinvented himself repeatedly, but something essential remained unfinished, some final transformation he needed to complete before the story could end. The surgery was brutal, medieval, the kind of medical intervention that required cracking open a chest and exposing the most vulnerable parts of human anatomy to skilled hands and sharp instruments. Bobby went under anesthesia, knowing he might not wake up, and part of him, the tired, desperate part that had been running since age 8, felt something like relief at the possibility of rest. But he woke up, woke to pain so comprehensive it redefined his understanding of suffering, woke to a body that felt like it belonged to someone else, woke to the knowledge that he'd bought himself more time but hadn't escaped the fundamental equation. The surgery was a success in the technical sense, but Bobby understood with crystalline clarity that he'd only postponed the inevitable, maybe bought himself months or a year, if he was extraordinarily careful. Careful. Bobby had never been careful a day in his life. Careful was for people who believed in tomorrow. Careful was for people whose hearts worked the way hearts were supposed to work. Careful was the opposite of everything Bobby Darin had built himself to be. Recovery was a descent into the kind of stillness Bobby had spent decades avoiding. Unable to perform, unable to work, unable to maintain the velocity that had defined his existence, he was forced to simply be. And being, without the distraction of becoming, meant confronting truths he'd been outrunning since childhood. He thought about his grandmother, dead now, the woman who'd loved him with a fierceness that felt like armor against the world's indifference. He thought about Sandra and their son, about the family he'd built and then abandoned in his compulsive need to keep moving. He thought about all the versions of himself he'd created and discarded. Bobby Darin, the teen idol, Bobby Darin, the sophisticated crooner, Bobby Darin, the folk activist, Bobby Darin, the Vegas showman. Which one was real? Or had they all been performances, elaborate constructions, designed to avoid confronting the scared kid from the Bronx, who'd been told his heart was a time bomb that could detonate at any moment? The revelation, when it came, wasn't dramatic or cinematic. It arrived quietly, during a conversation with his estranged son, who'd come to visit with the wariness of someone approaching a legendary figure who also happened to be his mostly absent father. Bobby looked at this boy, this young man really, and saw something he'd never allowed himself to see before. His own mortality wasn't the tragedy. The tragedy was all the moments he'd sacrificed to the altar of legacy, all the present he'd traded for a future he'd never actually believed in. He'd been so obsessed with leaving something behind that he'd forgotten to actually live, to be present, to experience the moments he was working so hard to memorialize. The records, the films, the achievements, they were all evidence of a life, but they weren't the life itself. And Bobby, who'd spent 37 years trying to outrun death, finally understood he'd been running in the wrong direction. The attempt at reconciliation with his family came too late to undo the damage, but early enough to matter. Bobby, who'd always been better at performing emotions than experiencing them, learned to sit with discomfort, to apologize without performing apology, to love without the protective armor of charm. It was harder than any stage performance, more terrifying than any cardiac procedure, and more important than anything he'd ever recorded. His son listened as Bobby tried to explain what it meant to grow up knowing you were on borrowed time, how that knowledge had poisoned every moment with urgency, while simultaneously making it impossible to be fully present. The explanations felt inadequate, couldn't undo years of absence and broken promises, but they created something fragile and real between father and son. Not redemption, but at least acknowledgement. Bobby started performing again, but differently. The desperation that had always fueled his performances, the sense that every show might be the last, remained. But now it came from a different place, not from fear of being forgotten, but from gratitude for still being here, for having another chance to stand in front of an audience and create something that existed only in that moment, that lived and died in real time and couldn't be archived or preserved. The audiences felt it, that shift from performance to presence. Bobby had always been technically brilliant, but now there was something else. A vulnerability, an authenticity that came from finally letting people see the scared kid underneath all the sophisticated arrangements. He sang the old standards with new understanding, heard the lyrics as if for the first time, connected to the emotional truth beneath the professional polish. Bobby Darin's heart finally stopped on a December morning after a second surgery that was always going to be a desperate gamble. He was 37 years old, having exceeded his childhood prognosis by more than 2 decades, having packed several lifetimes' worth of achievement and transformation into the space most people use to figure out what they want to be when they grow up. The obituaries cataloged his achievements, the hit records, the films, the awards, the remarkable versatility that had allowed him to succeed in multiple genres. They called him a chameleon, a talent that transcended categorization, an entertainer in the classical sense who could do it all. All of it was true. None of it was complete. What the obituaries couldn't capture was the particular quality of his desperation, the way every performance had been a race against time that only he could see counting down. They couldn't articulate how it felt to build a legacy while knowing the foundation was constructed on borrowed moments. They couldn't explain that Bobby Darin wasn't running away from death, but toward something he hoped might transcend it. His son, now a young man, stood at the funeral surrounded by legends and luminaries, all paying tribute to Bobby's genius, his versatility, his impact on entertainment. And he listened to them describe his father and recognized the truth underneath all the professional praise. Bobby Darin had been terrified his entire life, and he'd transformed that terror into art that made millions of people feel less alone. The records lived on, obviously. Music has that peculiar immortality, Bobby's voice continuing to sing songs he recorded decades earlier, still reaching people who weren't born when he laid down those tracks. But listening to those recordings with the knowledge of his story added new layers of meaning. Every song became a message in a bottle from a man who knew he was drowning but kept singing anyway. His final transformation, the one he was working on when his heart finally gave out, was the most important and the least documented. It was the transformation from Bobby Darin, the legend, to Bobby Casato, the human, from the manufactured persona to the frightened boy who'd been hiding underneath all along. He'd spent 37 years constructing elaborate facades, and in his final months, he'd begun the painful work of dismantling them, of allowing himself to be seen without the protective armor of performance. The irony wasn't lost on those who understood his story. Bobby had been desperate for immortality, terrified of being forgotten, driven to create a legacy that would outlast his faulty heart. And he'd succeeded beyond measure. His music, his films, his impact on entertainment culture ensured he'd be remembered. But the real legacy, the one that mattered to the people who actually knew him, wasn't the records or the achievements. It was the final lesson he learned and tried to teach. That presence matters more than legacy, that being fully alive in moments matters more than being remembered after those moments pass. His son carried this understanding forward, a gift from a father who'd been mostly absent but ultimately honest. Bobby Darin had been many things: teen idol, crooner, activist, actor, entertainer. But stripped of all the transformations and performances, he'd been a scared kid from the Bronx who'd been told he was dying and decided to make his abbreviated time matter. He'd succeeded in ways that transcended entertainment, failed in ways that were heartbreakingly human, and ultimately found grace in accepting both. The music played on, at weddings and funerals, in elevators and grocery stores, on oldies stations and streaming services. Bobby's voice continued reaching across decades. And if you listened carefully, really listened beneath the technical brilliance and sophisticated arrangements, you could hear something else. The sound of someone singing like every note might be their last. Because for Bobby Darin, that possibility wasn't metaphorical. It was the truth that shaped every moment of his too short, remarkably full life. In the end, the music stopped lying, not because Bobby learned to perform less skillfully, but because he finally learned to live more honestly. He'd spent 3 decades creating beautiful illusions about love and romance and happy endings. In his final chapter, he discovered something more valuable than any performance: the courage to be imperfect, the grace to admit he'd been running, and the wisdom to understand that the race had always been against himself rather than against time. Time won, as time always does, but Bobby Darin left behind something that transcended victory or defeat: the evidence of a life lived at full volume, a career that refused to be limited by categorization, and a legacy that reminded everyone who encountered it that mortality isn't the enemy of meaning. It's what gives meaning urgency, beauty, and truth. The boy with the broken heart had kept singing until his last breath, and the echo of that singing would continue long after the heartbeat stopped.